Welcome to the Living and Active Word podcast. In this week's episode, we'll cover the most well-known verse of the entire Bible, John 3:16, and the less known verse that follows it. So let's read verse 16 and 17. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. I want to encourage you to listen to the previous episodes if you haven't done so already. The reason being is that Jesus is right in the middle of giving Nicodemus the answer on how someone is going to be saved or born again. There's a reason why this verse is so famous. Because it summarizes the good news that Jesus came to die for sinners so that way we could be in heaven with him forever. What we also find in this verse is insight into the reasoning or the motive behind Jesus coming to earth. And that's that he loved humanity. He loved sinners. He was compelled by love to die for us. He wanted to demonstrate his love towards us, as Romans 5:8 tells us. But God demonstrates his own love towards us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Or as it says in 1 John 3:16, by this we know love because he laid down his life for us, and we also ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. Finally, it was necessary that Jesus came and died for us because he was the only acceptable offering that God would approve of. He was a perfect sacrificial lamb. Verse 17, a less famous verse, but yet a great verse. And it says that Jesus didn't come into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world. Have you noticed this yet? Have you come to this realization yet? That Jesus could have come into the world and brought fire and brimstone. Or he didn't even have to come into the world. He could have just condemned the world. Everyone is going to hell because that's what they deserve. No one is good, not one. They have all earned eternal death. But that wasn't God's plan. That wasn't God's heart. In 2 Peter 3:9, it talks about how his desire is that no one would perish. Obviously, there are many who do, but that's not God's heart nor his desire. And that's why he came to this earth, was to save, not to condemn. That was his objective of his first coming. And there are many people who have a lot of different thoughts or concepts of what God is like, that he's mean, cruel, judgmental, harsh, wrathful, and the list goes on and on of unbalanced theology. But the reality is that Jesus is love. 1 John says this, that he is love. He's a source of love. Not only that, but he's gracious and he's merciful and he's long-suffering. Why? Because that's who he is. That's what is in his heart, is forgiveness. He wants to heal. He wants to save. And that is what he came to do in his first coming. But don't forget that the Bible also says in his second coming that he will judge the world. Paul speaks of this in many of his letters. The book of Hebrews speaks of this. The book of Revelation clearly speaks of him judging the world. And Jesus himself in the gospel speaks of the fact that he will judge the nations. And so we have to have this balance that he is gracious, loving, merciful, forgiving. And he also is the righteous judge. And he will judge all people. But the first time he came was to save. The first time he came was as that lamb, the sacrificial lamb, the suffering servant. The second time he comes, he'll be the roaring lion, the righteous judge of all the earth. So we must keep that in mind, but let us not think too little or forget of the beauty and the love that God has already demonstrated, the objective of him coming the first time. And, you know, Christmas has just passed, and there's this song that came on the radio, and it was along these lines, and it really is a beautiful song. And it says, how many kings stepped down from their thrones? How many lords have abandoned their homes? How many greats have become the least for me? And how many gods have poured out their hearts to romance a world that is torn all apart? How many fathers gave up their sons for me? And I just want you to dwell on that. Think upon this reality that God, Jesus, He gave up many privileges, as Philippians tells us. Why? So that way he can be a slave and be obedient to the point of death on the cross for me and for you. I pray that that sinks in. I pray that that moves you. I pray that that just works in you and flows out through you. That God, His life, to demonstrate His love for us, so that way we could be with Him for eternity. And that's why John 3:16 is so famous and so beautiful. And John 3:17 is great as well, because it tells us, it gives us that insight into God's heart. Thank you for listening, and God bless.